gives me great pleasure to introduce Stephan Rutz as the final speaker in our lunchtime lecture series, which has been professionals. Stephan is somebody who's come for many years to RISD as a visiting critic. This is the first time that we've been able to embroil him in a lecture that's predominantly relevant to the World Architecture course and to our Urban Design Principles course, but it also gives you a glimpse of how people work in Zurich. Stephan is a graduate of the ETH and worked for many years teaching at the ETH, not in the architecture department, but in the building physics department. He is an architect with a nice practice that has, does anybody know Alex McCarger? You? Guys? Well, he graduated a few years ago. He works full-time in Stephan's office. Jesse Hansa has worked off and on and will come back. Jeremiah Watson seems every summer and every winter there while living in China at the same time. I don't know how he does it. Anyway, Stephan's practice moves in various different ways. He's published, along with Professor Keller, an incredibly useful and cutting-edge book on building energy called Pinpoint. It's in our library. It's online. Burkhauser publishes it in English. It also got several book awards because it's so beautiful. It's very scientific, but it's beautiful. And he has a practice that encompasses building buildings. He's working on a project that at one end is at Edgy-Gon, at the other end is Rutz Architects. And Stephan's part is 200 units of housing in Zurich, which is a lot of housing in Zurich. It's almost doubling the population. And he has smaller houses that he works on, but he also has a great respect from both the city of Zurich and developers in Zurich for doing zoning and potential building studies, which is something of great importance to us because the way in which zoning sets limits on what we can build, and he's an expert in that too. So we welcome you, Stephan. I'm very glad you're here and you didn't come by bicycle this time.
Well, thanks very much, Pete, for the kind words. And it's really a pleasure for me to be back. I missed the May season, and I'm glad that the surgeons have wonderful techniques that they screw me back together so I can wave like the Queen of England again. Dear students, colleagues, what I would like to present to you today is a different notion on how you have met me, or how, when Peter refers to the book, what usually I do when I teach, which is combining building and building energy, building technology. The idea to this lecture was happening sometime late last summer, in between the site with Jeremiah Watson, Peter and I, and this is sort of my answer to that discussion we had in the car. I borrow from Jim Jarmusch down by law, because a lot of the practice that we're fighting or that we're dealing with, shall it be energy, shall it be sort of, that's why also the book is probably called Facts and Figures. A lot of it is working with constraints. And you can either react to constraint as feeling them as a burden and excuse. So, oh, it's the law is like that, the energy is like that, I couldn't do more. Or you use it as a field of starting to set out in the very beginning. And this time I would like to look at how law, when we talk about law, we can somehow manipulate or maneuver within certain frameworks. If you would say law just very generally as a social contract, I think that's already a very good starting point for us architects. If a social contract is around us, it already means that our work is more than just a formal answer to a building job. It's a social intervention. It has something to do with taking attitude. It has something to do with taking opinion, expressing opinion, and therefore I think it's also, for me, very interesting to operate on various scales of projects, not only what we build, but also to get the study work that Peter mentioned, where we look at the city evolve over a much longer periods of time. We're used to having projects, we plan them, we build them, they're over and done with, but there is work that is conceived over time, and conceived in times that extends sort of my lifetime, might extend your lifetime. And I think these are very interesting notions of intervention when time is not like a political sort of 4-year span that you do something, but it's projecting yourself into a much further span of time. When I would have quoted the law as a social contract, we could sort of focus now what is within building as a constraint. And within the building, we would have, what I put together here is now what would be the constraints in Switzerland, what is called the planning and building law. And there is a level that is nationally solved. Switzerland is sort of an entity that is divided into what you have in states is cantons. There is a law on the cantonal level, and each canton is again subdivided into communities. And each community has its own law. So basically, if you practice in one community, make sure you study their law again, because it might be just slightly different or heavily different from the community you did work before. And then again, from canton to canton, it's all quite diverse. If you have the planning and building law, the building and zoning law, that basically puts together what you're allowed to build. 2 stories, 3 stories, 5 stories, how many square meters per land, but basically to me it's not so important how much floors or how many square meters I get, but how we use land and how land is put at disposition to settle, to enlarge cities. And at home there is studies that has been done by the ETH Basel studio by Bayard and Miley Peter, who have researched the use of land throughout Switzerland, and I think that's something that is also very important to keep in mind. How do we settle? And Switzerland is somehow like a carpet of little community after little community with full of little buildings, and we have to question, is that the right way to build, the right way to occupy land, the right way to use land? If I talk about the social contract, we could also take it a bit in a more liberal way and say law is just the boundary conditions. Boundary conditions that when we build, sometimes it's very visible limits, very visible laws, but sometimes are laws that aren't necessarily seen at first hand. Laws of nature, economics, you move within maths, physics and energy. Specifically the law of gravitation. I mean, you can build floors in any slope today, and computers have freed us in a way as a tool of how we can draw buildings, but tables still slide away if the floor is slanted too much. There is the law of conservation of energy, which means energy is always something that keeps in balance. If you spend energy, you have energy letting in. If there's something hot, the hot tries to warm the cold. There is always a dialogue going on, and I think that's something that we can translate into law of time and law of weathering. How do buildings age? How do we project a city to age or a city to transform in the longer run? So the law I have extended to say down by laws of invisible limits, and I would like to sort of make it specifically before or beyond the formal, because we're trained very well to answer formally how we take a stand towards a project design job, but I think we have to go beyond that. We have to take a stand on many more issues than just design, and I think that's also ground that we architects have to occupy, because the real estate and the building industry is a heavy industry, and we shouldn't be reduced just being the guys who do the icing for the cake, but we should really know how to bake the cake and what the ingredients have to do within a cake when it's in the oven. So the question would be, is the law or the laws, shall it be legal issues, shall it be laws of nature? Is this a constraint? Is it a straitjacket? Is it something that makes our work heavy? Or is it a playground? Is it a playground to find niches of intervention? Is it a playground that actually just is a starting point to set out on the voyage for a project? And are laws absolute or are they relative? They always are dealing, I think even on any scale, between public and private interest, in invisible acts of intervention, acts of intervention over time. As I said, the projects have spans that sometimes go beyond a lifetime. It can be from the city fabric to the community, to the neighborhood, to the house, or vice versa. And at the same time, this negotiation for the intervention is the cultural act that we architects are very privileged to contribute, and that's where I also think it's important that we do take a stand. Again, not only to be able to do nice forms, but to express with our solutions on every level, to be a part of contribution to a larger context than just the individual project. And a lot of the work that we have in the office is also how to convince the private, so it be the single client or a private client, in the participation beyond his own project. How can we get him to engage in a contribution to public? And that's where I would say we can always take reference to shared heritage, built environment, but also that's when I would introduce the negotiated space, so the negotiation between situations, clients, as a mode of not static, but dynamic. I would then go to invisible as in/visible in terms of negotiation with site, context, and public value, in terms of a dialectic strategy, so that the negotiation solution is a contribution that is not only my response, but starts to be a broader response involving the people who invest, involving the city, political processes, and that's something that's very important. Our project in Switzerland take a long time if I compare to China. There is this housing project Peter mentioned. I started out in 2008. It's 2012 now. We started construction in August and will build till 2015. So 7 years out of my life I'll have done with this project. And maybe as a guideline over everything, we can always retest a dialectic case in terms of the house in the city or the city in the house, because that negotiation to me can happen in a very small project, but also in the sort of even beyond, or the pre-urban projects that we're doing. And what I would like to show you is an illustration of a language of negotiation and intervention in different scales from a, I would say, very pragmatic practice that I try to have together with the people I like to collaborate. The first project would be under the name Borderline. It's a private client, very good friend of mine, who was actually the first client in my practice. He got me to do a little extension to the house he just bought. He moved in with 2 kids, eventually had 4 kids. The 4 kids started, growing up, and all of a sudden the 4 kids were not fitting the house anymore. So he needed another extension. And that is how the project itself had to adapt to family life, and that again indicates that things aren't stable around us. This is what we had done in the first move, the first extension. You see where the concrete ceiling is and the sort of That's the old part, the existing part, and we extend it further out into the garden, managing kitchen, eating area, which used to be the living and eating area. Kitchen was half a floor down, and around the kitchen is a room that is reserved as a living area. And after about 6 years, Jan came back and said, Stephan, I just need rooms for my teenage daughters. They scratch their eyes out. It's just unbearable. And the little ones, they can keep sharing the room, but I need 2 extra bedrooms in this house. So I started trying, when you see the first extension for the living room, we had added somehow a concrete wall around the garage to have like 2 volumes added to the existing house. But the 4 meters that are indicated here is a very, that was the negotiation. The law says buildings can go up to 4 meters to the borderline and not beyond. So I had a very hard time working with the existing structure to gain 2 extra children's bedrooms with their own bathroom. We had to replace the entrance, which was in the middle. We moved it on the side to have a big wardrobe. But there was a moment when Jan was very dissatisfied because all the structural interventions, they cost so much money that he felt he doesn't get enough room for the money he invests. My fee sort of was exploited. I was getting unhappy doing all the work and he's not happy with the job. So eventually we had a phone call, and the phone call resulted us shouting at each other. I got very upset because he had criticized my work attitude proposing the intervention into the structure, which sort of touched me emotionally very much, and I just burst out, you know, Jan, the only thing that we could do for you to satisfy would be, we forget about the shit we have done so far. You don't want an extension in your house, we just sort of do a provisional project. Your kids are now teenagers, they'll move out in 7 years, we do a project for 7 years' time, and then you throw the wooden bin away. There was a silence on the other side for about 30 seconds. Stephan, that's what we're doing, that's a great idea. So I started negotiating with the community to say, look, this guy's got a family problem, he needs extra rooms, he's your village doctor. He doesn't need that for the whole time of the future life of this house, but he needs it urgently for the time now. And I could negotiate with the community to get a permit of exception for a provisional building for 7 years, which eventually was this volume that we could add laterally. We could keep all the existing structure, which basically saved the money we could already buy the prefab element. I decided to go to, if I translate it to English, it's box factory. It was a manufacturer who had a reputation to ship big machines from the machine industry in Switzerland overseas. And they started doing prefab houses, so I said, I'll just buy a wooden box. We dimensioned it of whatever we could squeeze in the garden. The community said the green line, the hedge, we should not touch, but we can build up to the hedge, which basically dimensioned the space that I could bring in the rooms. And with the provisional permit for 7 years, we got the go-ahead. And in a way, it completed the conception of the first phase, having a box, if I may say so, in front, which was the living room added. On the one side, the garage element added. And now, for the limited time period, the provisional children's room. And he's really thinking now, maybe he might ask the community of an extra 2 or 3 years, but he already has plans what he could do with the box once it has expired its lifetime. And what was exciting really was the way of construction. The box was prefabbed in the factory. We went to see that. There is a sort of a joint piece that covers the external stair going down to the cellar. This would be the entrance into the existing house. We also have to watch that when they lift in the box, they don't break away the roof. So this sort of distance box helped us with that. The foundation was very simple. It was 12 holes with cement cylinders filled with concrete, put the box on it, and within about 3 days, sort of the boxes they could use, but the inside took a bit more, but within 3 days, the girls had their rooms, and the girls were really, really happy with it. The whole box is a very simple construction of OSB board beams, and the OSB board is sort of waterproof and vapor dense, so that was just cladded to both sides. The outside was painted green to fit the buxus hedge, and the inside I left OSB also because I thought teenagers, they want once a black room, pink room, and both girls were very happy that they could, you know, do whatever they wanted with the room because that's going to move away, and the parents let them do it because it wasn't the house, it was just the provisional building. And so that's how we solved the borderline issue. The next project is skipping in scale completely, which is probably the largest building site in Zurich. There was a short list of 8 teams to look at the development site called Gladpark, that's in between Zurich onto the way to the airport. Gladpark is a huge development area where they try to place international firms. The Kraft Foods is there now. They try to house people there. And the original project had anticipated 3 phases. And the city of Gladbruch wanted to have a test of the special zoning law they had put in place. There was a lot of pre-planning to start the project. And when they eventually started, they realized that what the guidelines were, you'll see that later on, wasn't what would start the site. So in order to be able to start to construct, they started to give themselves special permits that were not the law that they had specially put in place, but they did permits beyond the new building rules to be able to start to develop. And then the community thought that it might be advisable before they start the second phase to retest the special zoning law that they put in place and see how that could be adjusted to maybe make a better total development. For me, that is going on the law and exception. You have something that is installed as a special zoning law, but to start it, you already have to give the exception to the exception building law, which is somehow a very awkward situation. I said it was a public client, the biggest development site sort of in the area of Switzerland, phase 1 nearing completion, and that the building permit based on exceptions to start development at all. And what we were looking in trying to do is, I worked with a landscape architect, and in our collaboration we were immediately convinced that we have to take not the law as it was given as our guideline, but to knit on what the first phase started doing, so that we would make it complete in that sense, and not to go into a game of right or wrong, but into a game of permanence, of whole. And that's why we were using the ideas of knitwear, the pattern where you knit, but you have to deal with the edge, you have to deal with the arm, you have to deal with the neck. And that's probably the special parts, but we wanted to make it as a whole. This would be an aerial view, and if this is leaving the city of Zurich, and on top of the map would be the airport, it's all of this, with already a park that they had decided to reserve land, with an artificial lake that they started out, and with the first phase would have been all of this, second phase here, and the third phase was this rest lot. And you see there is one big block, there is sort of linear buildings here, and then here several buildings, but they form chains towards the artificial lake. This would be the legal plan behind the whole development, saying phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, for making a contribution to the public, the landowners had agreed with the city that they would do this park. It was an international competition. An office from Berlin had won that, and they were actually building the park and the pond before even the housing started. Then they were thinking that what is red should be housing, the light blue should be mixed use, and the blue would be office space. And in the first phase it was already clear that all of the mixed zone was completely housing, because in Zurich they had programs of 10,000 flats a year. There is about 80,000 foreigners moving to Switzerland, which is, compared to 7 million people, a lot that the city has to digest every year. And the office market had been saturated in the early 90s, so there is a lot of office space available, but housing is really a shortage, and basically you can build whatever you want and most of the projects go. So it's really important, even though real estate developers want to go fast, that you sort of are counter-working and try to achieve more than just the number of flats necessary. And we found, to our surprise, that the city had wanted like a 19th century city with what we call in German Blockgrund. I don't know the English expression, but
perimeter block.
Perimeter blocks, okay. The thing that they installed next to say that it should be a perimeter block development, they had a linear axis with a boulevard and transversal connections from the park to extend the park landscape up to the sort of heavy main road, where there's 3 or 4 lanes of traffic, and the new tram line that makes it from the city out to the airport. So it's really growing fast. There's a lot of traffic, and probably that was why they wanted to work with the perimeter blocks, but we were not satisfied in just using that fabric of definition of public space. We thought that the city has to achieve more than just building this pattern. So what we did is, as I said, in terms of Niederwehr, we referred to a piece by, a period of work by Issei Miyake in the 1970s, where he wanted to achieve clothing under or out of one piece of cloth. And we thought that was very challenging to understand. How do you have one piece with all its edges, with all its exceptions, but to have a fabric that goes to satisfy the whole development? So when we started designing, there were, like, the city had invited 3 teams, and 2 teams had already built on site, who were responsible for a few housing here, or the housing things that you saw up there. And these 2 offices, they were like, the study job was with intermediate presentations. And their strategies was to do a second phase that would be completely different. Point houses, different densities, different park landscape. And we thought that that would be a strategy that makes phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, but the city itself wouldn't come together. So the first assumptions we did was to say, where there is housing, we continue with the linear buildings that link the boulevard to the park. That should also make a link that the public space of the boulevard should get more emphasis. The second element was that we did not believe in the
perimeter
blocks, but started modulating volumes and surfaces that are much more occupiable for big companies if they want to do office space. So we had to have the notion of how can we care for office space that would actually be occupied or sold, and at the same time we tried to have a mix of functions. So when this zone before was only for office, we also postulated that especially along the boulevard, these front blocks should be as well flat, so that if you're there as a citizen, you don't walk a street that is full of light on one hand at night and the other side is dark because people stop working there. And you see very well how we attach to the first phase that was partly accomplished, and mostly accomplished. And then we started specifying. We started specifying the rules towards, for these linear parts between the park and the Boulevard Lilienthal. And it's important that you understand these figures. These were never meant to be the buildings. These were meant to be envelopes. Envelopes in which a project has to behave, so that it's like a common rule of game. If you have the front, you may do a project within this volume, but you can't set it here. You can't set it here. These parts could be deeper, but you can't occupy the public space. So basically these were like positive, negative shapes on where we defined access, where we defined traffic, where we defined park areas, and volumes within which the square meters could eventually be consumed. Once we had done sort of the gross massing, we started overlaying it with the private properties, and you'll see an image later on, but all here, these are private perimeters. And we wanted to develop a strategy that each one building contributes to the whole, but the people, the single landowner does not have to negotiate with his neighbor to start construction. So we try to have something that is a total fabric and at the same time works for the individual, so that each investor would be independent on his own decisions to start building, to see what kind of building, and that's why it was important to adopt the sort of the massing and the reservation for building and public space, to adapt that exactly to the boundary lines of private property. And then one move that we thought was very, very important to us, we wanted to work the office mass with the sort of high heavy traffic road, that at the entrance we wanted a much more public appearance for the city fabric. There was 2 new tram lines with important tram stops just right at the edge, and we didn't want to use the perimeter block to occupy up to the street front. We wanted the mass of the building square meters that could be consumed to recess in a similar maneuver, probably like Mies van der Rohe's project in New York, that there is a public space in front of it and actually access into the area from a public space and not the street front. And then the final stage was, you see that, the inscription of different building typologies into what we had defined as the urban massing. Which eventually resulted in possible volumes that would be within the building mass, trying to exploit view from the park. The original building code had foreseen that the highest building should be at the street and they should eventually step down towards the lake, and we thought there should be a better emphasis if what is at the lake could also go higher up. There is a great view into the mountains even, and we wanted to have more depth for these buildings so that there is always lateral views or diagonal views possible for each building to participate in the wider range of a public space and not only what is happening just around the house. So we try to convince the city that there's a good strategy you started. If you do it by exception, that's fine, but you have to keep on knitting it to make it a whole with possible exceptions or extensions of the law of height, of creating the public space for the arrival area, and how the network of public space was extended with spaces in between the main office volumes for reservations of access to the car parks underground. But basically finish off first phase with an extension with decisions they had taken as exceptions to apply this to the whole system. And then in the third phase, that we thought this has nothing to do with the fabric that we wanted to be completed as a finished knitwear. So we decided to have a different strategy and treat especially this one like an island. We thought this could be heavily planted with trees and create like an artificial island with the high-rise office tower standing out there. And I think it shows pretty well on how we try to approach and try to make the whole area at the lake to appear as a one piece. The city itself, they were very happy with all the results. They had seen two teams doing something completely different, and they realized that they had one proposal to continue knitting, and in the end they realized they couldn't change anything in the special zoning law because they did that job 2 or 3 years too late, and there was no time for the political process to actually change the law, and they just had to keep the special zoning law as they had installed it in the beginning and keep on building with special building permits as exceptions. So the timing, basically, they were very interested in what they might learn, what they might do as exceptions, what architects might do as a solution, but the political time was not taken into consideration, and you could be mean and say they could have saved that money and invested it in more public space. But for us it was really very, very interesting work. And again, that's why I say this is probably before the formal. Maybe one reference to the typology. What we wanted for this housing, compared to the first phase, we wanted a typology that on the first look looks the same, to strengthen the identity of the site, so that there is something with the attic should not be recessed all around. The attic should always reach at least 3 facades. Laterally, there should always be additions to formulate entrances, to formulate bicycle storage, to formulate kindergartens. But the typology, once established, would allow each house to combine these elements in a different way. So when you look at these buildings on a second look, you suddenly start to see the differences between the different elements. All right. So this was a work that we did probably during half a year. The city consulted, and the second phase is under construction. The next project I'm going to show you is another political process. It's downtown Zurich. The project, though, the time of intervention is probably in a timeline that we won't get to see what we did. It's about inversion, it's about continuation of public space. The city of Zurich, or the Office for Urban Development, who was the client, and if the city was the client, there was Swiss Railway was involved, the local area representatives were involved, the people of public transport were involved, so there was about 12 different offices. Green Zurich, which is the garden department or the public space department, that was involved, and we were trying to negotiate in a very complex field a solution to have a site that could be understood as the entrance of Zurich. You will see immediately in the aerial view, which is actually an entrance, but it's the back side. There was an incision for railway that was built in 1875 as the back borderline. There were building lines of the 1960s, and in the 1960s in Switzerland also traffic engineers had taken over urban development, so there were building lines reserved to have high frequency traffic right through the middle of Zurich. And the new job was that in the planning for the future development of urban transport, there should be an incision for a new tram line. And the engineers of the public transport department had come up with a design, you'll see that, where they just thought this is good for the speed of the tram, this is the right distance for the tram. If you have curves, the curves determine the speed of the tram lines. So they just took everything which served them well, but there was no contribution in terms of city understanding. And we wanted to use the infrastructure to actually reform the whole area and not just build the tram line. So it's really downtown Zurich. You see the old train station of Zurich, with the middle part being its first sort of conception. The train arrived at the bottom of the old city up there. You might see even parts of the old fortress of the medieval city. And you must understand that most of this land is 19th, 20th century city. So when the city at the time decided to link and keep on developing public transport, they were cutting this incision for the railway. Basically that was outside the city confinement. And the area we're looking at is that there is a tram line that should be started here. This is our lot of land, and this tram line should connect onto this part of the city to have a new sort of link. And Zurich is very good in public transport. They do a great job. You can really time your clock by the public transport, but it's thought in an engineer way and not in terms of contribution to the city and development of the city. Even though I think infrastructure, and that's something that I learned from Jose Acebillo when he did a great lecture at ETH, who said, you know, transformations and development of cities are not done by a single project. They're done by the right arrangement and the right development of infrastructure and public transport, because that's what dimensions the city. So even the aerial view here, there's a few maps that say this is the sort of the city plan for the building code. The 5 stands for the maximum stories. A, B, C, D stands for special building depths that you're allowed to do. The blue are the building lines. So if you build a project here, you have to build with one facade onto the blue line. But at the same time, this seems a very clear starting point. At the same time, the same area is in what they call a high-rise zone. In the high-rise zones, there are 3 within Zurich. 1, high-rise zone 1, you can go, the height can be negotiated by the public project or by a competition contribution. In zone 3, high-rise can go up to 40 meters. And in Zurich, a high-rise is if the top slab is higher than 22 meters, you fall into the high-rise category, which basically is not very high. So the question is, everybody would like to do a high-rise because it would allow you to consume more square meters. Now, how do you negotiate between the city fabric, the private who would like to have a high-rise, and the city who says you can have a high-rise if you contribute to the city? So it's a whole range of negotiation, and if you imagine this on a pattern again, overlay the city structure with private ownership, and you see how many different small portions of private property there were within this context. And it's very difficult to bring that many different interests under one thing of urban development. So our starting point was the city plan, where you see the violet building line. That was a trajectory for basically, maybe not the highway, but the sort of on canton level, the most important hierarchy of street, which would have just cut through the whole area, eventually go through a tunnel and directly out of the city. And due to this legal intermixing between private ownership, building lines from the 1960s, there was no development in the area, because if you owned this house and you wanted to build, you couldn't, because you should be a street. If you wanted to build this house, and the orange marks that this was not just a house, it was registered for heritage. So basically, if you wanted to build the highway, you had a fight between the people who said, no, no, you can't take this house down. This is heritage. You have to go around us, but you can't go around us because the street is where it has to be. So basically, it was a deadlock situation, and we intervened in that deadlock basically by using the engineer's plan. The engineers had said, this is ideally what we have. We start from the train station. We have the first stop at the entrance of this area. We drive around with the ideal curves to have maybe a stop somewhere back here and drive out. And at that moment, they didn't, how should I say, speed wasn't timed, property wasn't timed, but there was not really an argument on the urban level, and we tried to help them exactly with that. The first thing we did was looking at these maps. Is an instrument by the city of Zurich, where they look at the relationship between density of housing, square meters of housing, number of people, and how well they are in connection with public space, where it says everything yellow or light orange is good, the orange is just satisfying, red is bad, and the pink is, or the violet is very bad. So you see that for people who live here, at this area, even though all the railways arrive, there is actually, they have classified it as completely unsatisfactory. There's a ratio of head per hectare that they have analyzed. The same map, if it's not for people who live there, but for people who work in the area, looks a bit better, but still, especially this area is rather critical. And right now, the interest was, this area is now a big development. It's going to completely invert the city, and the piece that we looked at is somehow like the missing link to make the whole fabric complete. So we started arguing not by the speed of tram line, by the diameter of tram line, but we tried to argue with intervention. And as a reference work, I would like to introduce the work by Rhode, Swiss artist. And he has a series of work that he called free repair, which means if he goes through the city and finds a place that a hole has been dug out to do whatever underground needed, it's been replaced in a funny order, he just goes and makes a free repair. And to me that was a very nice way to think about public space. How can I take a stand of an intervention that is somehow invisible, somehow not authored by formalism, but authored by making something complete. And we looked at, sort of based on this work, you'll find more examples under rolandrose.net. We looked at a plan that Green Zurich, sort of those guys who look into the public space, it's a plan that they have established. Zurich is a very green city. It's a network of alleys, and they call this the boulevard or the Alleenplan, where everywhere where there should be trees following up the road has been marked, has been labeled, but it's also the strategy plan. And we thought we should make a free repair and just add in the extra circle to make this area as a continuation of the public space, and somehow the incision that had been started in 1875 with the railway going here, that these alleys that are in place suddenly should just lead the way that actually the whole area becomes a public promenade. And once arguing the public promenade, we had arguments to time the public transport, to time tram stop, and basically constructed it. We're looking at where would it be best if they need a tram stop, and sort of place it very clearly in front of this building block, so that access would be immediately direct into the existing city fabric, and the different patterns of transport, or the street pattern, the public transport pattern, started to overlap in a very orderly way. and public space would be reserved with a wider range here for the tram stop to cater for a wider number of people, having the edge, since this is an incision, having the edge finalized by continuing, as I mentioned, these rows of trees until you enter into the city. And what was also good in terms of strategy is what the city was very glad. We managed to sort of slow down the tram line to a different curve, and it was very challenging for us to drive, to draw tram radiuses. I mean, we had hundreds of versions, and each version was a different speed, was a different angle, was a different. We were really measuring how many of the existing fabric in this building block could actually be kept, and we managed not only to save this one, but we could even save the one building in front. And the yellow ones are the ones that either would have to go, or the ones that were already in that area. There were already projects that these buildings should be replaced. We presented it, and we could get the consent of, as I said, the Swiss Federal Railway, the public transport, the city development, the Green, Zurich. Everybody consented, except, and that's where this post is from, the people who live there, because it is an intervention into their living neighborhood. And to establish or to change the building lines of the 1960s, this is a legal procedure. This goes into a public vote. And these people started going, this is the real estate sharks, this is the people who want to thrive the poor people out. And in a way, I have a very big sympathy with these people, because it is a transformation. But we thought that there was a lot of motivation to, if you read the city structure, that it's about the network of public space that would install over time, and would be a contribution not only for the people who live there, but in a wider range to the development of the city of Zurich. So this is how it came to a vote, and eventually it passed. So this is going to be the new building lines. There is the first few developments that have started now, because the deadlock had been ended. This part, which was already projects before, is taken down and is into development. Probably I should say this is how they had argued. This is how many houses have to go. But they secretly had also this line, and they didn't talk about the houses that were bound to go if you would realize according to the building lines of the 1960s. So it was actually an evaluation between what can we gain for the city of Zurich, and that was our argument. So eventually I was very happy that this free repair was the base for the new building lines. But the incision is made in 1875, and there is first developments now, but the tram line 1, that was a priority 2005, 2006, is not a priority anymore for the city of Zurich, so it might be another 100 years until the city is where we thought it, but it might also be that over time city development will ask for something else. And after these very large-scale interventions in public space, I would like to present you a last reference work from the work in the office, which is again under the title The City in the House, and that is sort of the dialogue I appreciate very much, always work in different scales, because the focus and the concentration on different questions is always enriching the discussion on different levels. It's a private client. The private client had a site. He bought the land. You will see again the aerial views on a fantastic site above Lake of Zurich, with a view from the Alps to nearly the city of Zurich, the Lake of Zurich. It's all in front of you. But when we got to the site, which is up here, you see the Lake of Zurich. All of this development is maybe, or most of it, is happened in the last 20, 30 years. There is an incredible amount of building going on. And our client had bought this property. So you have a very heavy Kantonstrasse in your back with a lot of trucks going by, steep uphill. So it's quite loud in your back, but in front of it you see it's a wealthy area. It's a wealthy area with a lot of nice accessories from the situation itself. This is overlaid with the legal issues again. The legal planning and zoning law says in this area, this house, the yellow means you can consume 1.1 square meters from the size of the property. So if the property is 1,000 square meters, you could build 1,100 square meters for living. And the house we were commissioned to build on that, maybe just marking the loud street in the back as one of the conditions. The house we were commissioned to build looked like this. A relationship to the garden with a swimming pool as the neighbors have, 3 rooms in the back, living, and then again living, and on the top of the house, 2 rooms, 2 bedrooms. Now when I say we were commissioned this house to build, it's a very special situation. We were called in once this house had the building permit, so this is not what we were designing. There was a moment that I thought, when I was asked whether I would put in a tender to build this house, I said, I'm not doing this. I haven't drawn it, this is not my thing, it's a terrible house. I disagree with the situation, I'm not moving in. But one of my staff who had brought the job is basically the person who asked us whether we would want to put in a tender was his brother-in-law. And the person who worked with me was a very young, energetic architect who had graduated from ETH, but he had so many different interests, from photography to socialize to life, that I thought this might really be the right thing as a sort of a bone for the dog to bite. And I said, Felix, I'm going to put in, but I'm only putting it in if we can say what's wrong with this house. So we made a tender and said, look, there's structural issues that are unsolved. I don't want to be responsible. There's issues for the thermal enclosure that aren't solved. There is problem of the situation. There's problem of access. And if you don't help me responsible for those circumstances, that's the bit that we're doing. And to my surprise, we got the bid. So all of a sudden we started to work, and I had to get rid of that image, and we started, eventually working, understanding the house better. And one of its terrible defects was the garage. You had seen the situation with the road at the back, the private access on the side, and when you park your car in the garage, you close the garage door, you were standing outside again. There would be the possibility to either go upstairs here, or you would enter into the house and go to your lower flat. But if you were the one in the upper flat, there was a way through the house, inside, outside to the back, upstairs, outside, inside again to go upstairs. And the house didn't have an elevator. We started, as I had said, I don't want to be responsible of that. We do the execution drawings for you, and I hope that Felix would make his decision on the way of this project, whether he wants to be an architect or something else. Just about at this stage, when we had rebuilt the whole thing to start the execution drawings, the client behind the project, who wasn't his brother-in-law, but who was a couple that had bought the land to take the old house down and build new houses and make profit of it, stopped because they couldn't sell what they had planned before, and asked us, could you come in and make proposals for adjustments, to make improvements to the house. And we did, and the client was very feverishly for these changes, but when I reflected on the house, I felt I'm just doing plastic surgery, but the house isn't the right house for this site. So while we were somehow doing the plastic surgery to convince the client we have something to contribute, retrospectively in the office we did a new project, and that completely changed my position between the relationship, the stand I had to the project. First I thought it's a coaching job, and now I was suddenly emotionally involved. And the emotional involvement is also based on something that I cherish very much in the work, and that is a reference to French painter Pierre Soulages, who talks about the outre noir, the black beyond. The French say outre-mer for overseas, so they have the coastline, then there's the sea, and what's behind. And I'm very much interested in this space. So I wrote the French because my translation might not be as he had intended it perfectly, but it says, we say color, and in his case it's black. But the most important in a painting are the light and the space that are born with it, and from which you cannot separate it, which means as a spectator, and he talks especially about the space in between the painting and the observer, which automatically has me as part of the painting. I'm suddenly inside. And this dialogue of space is something that I always try to ponder. Where is the beyond the formal? Where is the beyond the expected? Where is the beyond of what I already know? And I think in his paintings there's really the relevance to that. This is a painting out of the series I think in the 90s, where this is black acrylic, and you see how he works it then with the spatula, he draws line, and by creating the surface gets light to reflect in different ways. And that's what he says is the space and the light between the spectator and the painting itself. It's very fine shade sometimes. So with that approach, we said we should not only do plastic surgery, we wanted to propose a new building. And we worked on two levels. One was the massing itself of the building. How could we knit it more into the situation? That was one of the main works from the outside. But much more, I felt, how can you have an attic with a little terrace, with a bedroom of 16 square meters, with another bedroom of 15 square meters, 2 bathrooms. But actually that's where I felt like it's like an eagle's nest. And why don't you exploit the side that on top is where you live? And with images like this, we started trying to convince the client that he should inverse what he had anticipated before, and that the garden is one, but the view is the other. And I'm against projects that only are oriented to the view outside. There's so much of an internal view as well. But in this situation, it was very important to negotiate the city in the house, to get that as a sort of spiral cord for the project. And with these two images, we could convince the client that we start not only doing plastic surgery, but he accepted our new proposal for the total massing. So one of the things that we did very quickly was inverse the situation of the car park. Instead of digging it into the hill, we said we could actually use the volume of the garage, one, to separate between the private garden and the public access, but at the same time, this extrusion off the ground would actually suddenly give the lower flat such a big terrace that it's not only the privileged guy of the upper flat who has a great spectacular terrace and view, but also the lower one who before was a bit underground, a bit hidden behind the neighbor. All of a sudden we raised the lower flat onto a platform that they both have equal qualities. And the second maneuver was, in a way, it was like a peacock throwing the feathers. Most neighbors had blocks, flat roof, and I tried to work it out that I imagined more like a sun watch up on the hill, that if it had the spiral cord at the back or the wall, you'll see that afterwards, is sort of shielding off the noise, but the rest of the building should present itself in the skyline of the hill like a solar watch that would actually make the daytime readable through the different projections of shadow. This is how the house would be organized. You have the access into the garage. Now the access is direct from the two car parks each party has into the staircase. It has very central an elevator, and the story was that the client is, as most clients are, a very difficult person. Now, I could say he's a difficult person, but probably I'm a difficult person too. And so we really have to negotiate between these circumstances. And there was a moment where we had the elevator not very central, it was lateral, I wanted it the back side, and I thought this side is perfect for 2 flats. But since the first project didn't sell, the guy had already invested and maybe lost a bit of money. He thought it should be good enough for 3 flats. So to rework a 2-flat construct into a 3-flat construct, I moved the elevator central so this elevator would be capable of serving the number of units that this guy eventually had in mind. It turned out we reworked the project, but the first party who bought was buying the upper part, and that guy said, I don't want only half of first floor, I want the whole first floor if I buy. So he had already 2 floors gone, and eventually he decided he likes the house so much that he keeps the lower unit himself now, which makes me happy too. But the form itself, if I would have known this in the beginning, I would have said, I'll never build a house like that. But through circumstances, through networking into the ground, by sort of inverting the private-public, we really managed something that I found as a surprise myself. With here a huge space for kitchen, eating, living with this terrace. And this side is now the guest wing with a private bath. Quiet and quiet. First floor, attic, and now the view from top floor from the living room onto the Lake of Zurich. And this is now our counter position to the rendering you had seen in the beginning. And I do these renderings with a freelancer who is a great contribution to me because he works in a way of, I would call it hyper-realism, but he thinks the building with us, and he was the one who said, this is a house with 3 south facades, and I liked it so much that I would replace the sun clock to the house with 3 south facades. This is how it looks now if you look from below towards the house. We're just about doing the slab at the bottom now, and it should be finished spring 2014. So the down by law for me is I extend the law now from what is all constraints, the law of outre noir, beyond the thing itself. Then I try to work in the practice with the law of curiosity, of doubt and determination. I think doubt or questioning is very important, not to fall into the trap to repeat yourself. And each time we try out the loader of coherence and completion, that if we manage to answer many questions in a similar way, I think that is what we strive for. And the promise working this way is that from the law of outre noir you find discovery. The law of curiosity and doubt and determination spurs surprise, the good and the bad, but it's always a surprise. And the law of coherence and completion gives satisfaction sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I would like to finish with a quote by artist Lawrence Weiner, who once had a piece of work that went bits and pieces put together to present a semblance of a whole. And this is the permanent jobbing we do with our work. Thank you for listening, and thank you.